Welcome. My name is Ronald Royer. I'm the music director and conductor of the Scarborough Philharmonic. I'm also a composer, cellist, and music producer. And we're very excited about tonight's workshop with the Odin String Quartet. I'll let each of them introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Alex. I play the violin in the quartet.
My name is Tanya, and I also play the violin in the quartet.
My name is Matt, and I play viola in the quartet.
And I'm Sam, and I'm playing cello.
Thank you. I'd like to say this workshop is presented by the Scarborough Philharmonic as part of our New Generation Composers project. And this particular workshop is supported by the RBC Foundation and is also supported by the CMC. So thank you for our sponsors. This workshop focuses on how to effectively compose for string instruments. Detailed information will be presented on left-hand fingering and right-hand bowing techniques. For the left hand, positions, shifting, double stops, chords, harmonics, high position strategies, extended techniques like quarter tones, and more will be discussed and demonstrated. For the right hand, different types of bow strokes, articulation, slurring strategies, moving from arco to pizzicato and back, legno, so ponticello, extended techniques, and more will also be examined. Strategies for notating left hand, e.g. harmonics and bowing techniques, will be included. Strategies for composing for a string quartet will be covered, and participants in person or online will be able to ask questions, and where possible, the string players will demonstrate all of these techniques. So for most of you, some of this information is probably you already know. Some of it hopefully will be new. If you're a string player, this is all kind of secondhand to us, but we're all the time when working with composers, we have people asking questions about specifics about string writing, and that's why we decided to have this workshop, and we hope you will find it useful. Okay, so let's start off with the bow arm. So bow strokes and techniques. So first of all, legato. You can play separate notes legato, but generally using slurs is better. Depending on the dynamic, slurring 1 to 4 beats in a slower tempo is the most common. And the louder the dynamic, the more bow is needed. So also acoustics make a big difference. If you're in a room that's very live, string players don't have to push as hard. If it's fairly dead, you're going to have to play louder, which means more bowing. So that also be aware that bowing can change in different contexts. Okay, so can we just compare just playing different bows, quarter notes, and then slurred notes? Just something very simple like four notes slurred and 4 notes separate.
So let's try the D major.
Sure.
Four, maybe 4 down, 4 up. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now let's do 2 for bow.
Okay, well that really is kind of a hooked bowing, where you're slightly articulating each note. So this is where things get very subtle and very complex. So if you are a string player, you know there's a huge variety between totally smooth and very short, and there's everything in between. And I think this is one of the most important things that composers don't always notate, but should be the area where they really want to be clear. How long or how short do you want notes to be? So let's do completely legato, just 4 notes slurred. Yeah, so that's the most legato you get. Now if you have 4 quarter notes, separate bows, you could get very close to that, but it's going to be just not quite as legato. So it's similar, but just a little different. Now, it's very common to mix slurs and separated notes. So the pattern 2 slurred, 2 separate is a very common pattern. So can we just try that?
2 slurred and 2 separate.
Sure.
Great, great.
If I may add, when it comes to slurs, they can give us the idea of the phrasing rather than just how we should be playing them. So they can be showing us the idea where the phrase is going or where the phrase is finishing, or and then we can always try to mimic the same idea by using as many bows as it feels comfortable, depending on the tempo, depending on how the piece feels to the performers. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be micromanaged exactly into 2 plus 2 or 1 plus 3 or 4 plus whatever. So that's definitely another possibility.
I mean, at the same time, it's worth mentioning too, though, that our first instinct will be to take the slur as a bowing first. So we'll always assume it's a bowing, and we'll sometimes then look and figure out that it's more of a, like if a pianist is writing a piece, as a pianist, you're used to writing big slurs as a phrasing mark, is what you're kind of implying and talking about. We see that in Brahms, for example. He does like these long slurs, and we go, that's not a bowing. Definitely not a bowing. So then we'll make that call, and then it gives us the discretion. And we'll kind of always take the discretion to a certain extent, but we'll always assume it's a bowing first. So I think that's a good thing to think about when you're putting in a slur in general in pieces.
Yeah, I think a really critical thing is you always want to give your performer notes on emotionally what you're looking for in the piece. So whether that's instead of saying quarter equals 100, it's much better to say moderato, allegro, or allegretto, or and whatever language you feel comfortable in, whether it's Italian, English, French, or whatever. But any kind of indications that let the performers know what you're looking for musically, what kind of interpretation, is really critical, because that information enables us then to find the best bowings for making it happen.
And when in doubt, do both.
Yes.
Put both the metronome marking and the instruction. It's brilliant for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. So we talked about very legato playing, and just even little subtleties can make differences, and those are things composers need to think about. Now let's talk about more shorter notes. So first of all, marcato. So obviously very accented, but still it could be a very short, even if you have a quarter note with an accent. Sometimes a composer wants the note fairly short. Other ones, they want it to full value. So these are all things we have to think about. So anyways, should we just do a basic marcato?
Should I just do it alone? Just that way there's not a different...
Yeah. So typical marcato that I would see, I would do something like...
And then if you really want to make it intense, then you have all down bows. And then, and this is the one time you would, generally string players, we don't like to see a lot of down and up bows. We want to make those calls ourselves, and everyone's going to do a little differently. But if a very specific technique is you want the players to keep retaking down bows. Usually it's quarters or eighths. You can only go so fast because you have to lift it up, but it's very effective if you want something really hammered. So. Yeah, and then when you do eighth notes, it's pretty cool. Bum, 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 like Stravinsky, in the Rite of Spring.
And unfortunately, the retakes come with a little bit of time taken away from the notes, so it's not going to be necessarily as long as when we play them on a... But they're going to come with much more power, so...
If you do put them closer together, like in faster rhythms, it can sound pretty cool. And I think that's kind of, what Ron is saying with the multiple retakes, it can really give a lot of guts.
Yeah.
And from a technical perspective, when you're writing that kind of technique, it's a kind of technique that you'd want to make sure that you know what you're doing when you're writing it. And you don't need to micromanage it within that. So if you're writing all eighth notes or all quarters, we don't need the dots. We don't need rest in between to indicate that time taken. We'll assume that you know that if you've written all down bows. And if you're looking for, then you, we need to make sure that when we see that on the page, we assume that that is known. We don't need like a dotted eighth with a 16th rest to take care of
That's right.
silence or dots or anything like
That's
that, right?
Yeah,
So it's one of
absolutely.
those.
Yeah, that's right. As soon as you know the down bows, you're going to have a space between
Right.
the notes.
Right.
Now, one thing I should mention that I've seen is when you do this technique, is usually the rhythms are pretty similar, whether quarter notes or eighths. But if you have a passage where you have all kinds of rhythms, doing a dum, ba, 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 if you're doing eighth, 16th, that could be actually quite awkward and not the most effective way to use all down bows. So if you're going dum, ba, ba, it just it doesn't quite work. But if you bum, 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 then yeah.
You're right. I never thought of that. But you're right.
Yeah,
It's true.
because it makes it kind of cancels the special effect. It makes it very difficult to play, and then you don't get what you're looking for. So a lot of these things are very specific. But quarter notes, eighth notes, no problem. Okay, now staccato. Now staccato is generally on the string, but this could range from being almost legato to being very short. And what we heard at the very beginning is you did, and you could slur 2 notes, 3 notes, 4 notes, or even more notes, 6, 8, again, depending on how loud you want to be. But it has a different feel than if you do it separate bows. So you'll a lot of times in an orchestra, even with Mozart or something, instead of just doing eighth notes in a slow movement, bum, 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 simple, we'll do it 4 notes hooked, bum, 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 and it just gives it a little more elegance, a little more grace. It can be a little bit more musical, and these subtleties do make a big difference in the way we interpret. So can we just try that? Just the difference between doing groups of eighth notes separate, and then doing groups of 4 staccato hooked bowing. Yeah, we could just do the.
Do you want to try?
So 4 notes.
4 notes hooked, and then 4 notes separate.
Staccato.
Yeah.
Would be hooked. I'll do that. I'll do a better job of that. And separate.
Okay. Now that time you were lifting the bow off the string.
Usually when it's that tempo, if it's faster.
That's right.
Because if you stop the bow, you get kind of the stop of in resonance as well. Right?
That's right.
Which is a certain effect, but my instinct would be to, when it's
That's right.
a little slower, to kind of, I mean, it's maybe a bad note because there's an open string. Say, if I'm playing an E, my instinct, if it's staccato at that tempo, would be to lift the bow a bit so that I have the resonance. If I don't, you hear the stop of it, right? Which is, again, it's a certain effect, but yeah, whereas if it's on the string, that's really the only option.
Yeah, and I would notate that is dotted. So you have the note, you put a dot on it, and then you put a slur on it on top. And then that just says you separate the notes, but going in the same direction. And so basically that's Matt makes a couple of really good points. Generally, as string players, we want our instruments to resonate because that sound will carry. If you're in a hall, you want the sound to carry. And if we allow the instruments to ring, they will. And if we kill the sound, it will die on stage. So and plus it sounds harsh. I mean, it's one of the big differences between a student string player, a beginning student, and a pro is that the students are in the string crunching, and you have to learn how to get the bow off the string. So a lot of times when we're playing, as Matt demonstrated, you lift the bow off so the instrument and the note will sound beautiful and resonate, unless you purposely want it to be really intense, and that sometimes is the goal. Certainly, it's easier to play ugly than it is to play beautiful. So, so in many ways, you got something really intense, you're digging in and scratching. It's actually much easier to do that than to play Mozart very elegantly and beautifully. And so these are all the subtleties. So in many ways, it's easier to play a Shostakovich quartet than a Mozart quartet really beautifully, because Mozart is so unforgiving, where Shostakovich is dig in and go for it and have fun with it. So now let's do this same thing, the hooked bowing staccato, but more legato. So in this case, you would notate it as a tenuto mark over the note, and then the slur. So Tanya, do you want to try this one?
Something like that would be.
Yeah. And that's what I was, when I was talking about a Mozart symphony, very often you'll have these passages where you have a beautiful melody and the strings will be bum, 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 and we'll hook it because it just could be a little more elegant and we could shape it a little better versus bum, 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 bump, which is a little more,
Yeah. It also gives the idea of line to have the slur over the top of it, whereas without the line, doesn't mean that we can't do it, but it just requires maybe a little bit more thought and effort. And so like the more you write for students, if you do stuff like that, they don't really get that, but the more you write for professionals, we kind of intuit those things. But it's also just nice to have that slur over there to just that's the hint.
We like to get away from the MIDI.
This is great. This is great. And so this is staccato, which is on the string. Now spiccato is when we play off the string. And spiccato is actually really great when you want something to be really clean and clear at a fast tempo. So though it can, it could vary from a fairly, moderate to a fast tempo, but you could really, and it sounds really virtuosic. Can you play? It's just a.
So when you want to make like in a Haydn, this is a Haydn quartet excerpt, actually a pretty hard one. And if this was, and if Haydn was alive and said, that was a little too short for my taste, maybe he would have written with lines as in tenuto, and then it was on. And then if he said, I still want it a little bit more connected, and I would probably play something like. Just showing how many possibilities there are. Or if he said, no, actually the first time I preferred very short, but even shorter than that, I could even play it a little bit more, kind of a combination of technique where I'm choking the string a little bit more and just making it even more kind of vertical movement. So. And how would we notate this?
Notationally, I think, and this is where spiccato can be really interesting. First of all, you don't need to tell us that it's spiccato, because we will do whatever is comfortable for us. There's kind of like a limit to the speed at which one would stay on the string, and once we surpass that limit, it becomes more natural for us to just want to release some of that energy and lift the bow. So if you want it to be shorter, that's where I would use more words to tell us exactly what you mean, or if you have the liberties of actually speaking to the musicians themselves, if there's a specific moment that you want that particular shortness, then you just express that. Sometimes, but sometimes words do take us a lot further.
Yeah.
I think notationally as well, I mean, it's kind of like if there's a passage marked with a bunch of dots, we'll take those dots, that information, and we'll take it with the tempo marking and the general context, excuse me, and make our own decisions on what's the right stroke. And I think adding spiccato to it or staccato might be information that goes against our technique considering the context. And I think it's a little bit akin to like, if you put a bunch of notes and there's no slur or anything, and you write legato, that's important information for us to know. But if you put a slur on it and you write legato, it's redundant, and we kind of go, well, yeah, we're doing that, right? And so
Yeah.
those dots tell us what we need to know in the context that is there, giving us a sense of like the style of playing is useful. But writing spiccato, again, it's one of those things that I think it's really important to know what it sounds like and what we're doing. But it's one of those things where if it's written in, it should be very deliberately, you should really know what you're doing in that context. So it's like, it's kind of basically telling us, yeah, I know it's not really fast enough, but I'm looking for this specifically, or something like that. And if it's fast enough, then we'll do it anyways.
Right.
Yeah. Well, this is where it gets really complicated.
Yeah.
Because context is everything. Because you could write the same notes and bowings, and in one context, it's going to tell you within the scope of this piece to play it this way versus that way, or slightly different. And so it gets really complicated. And I think one of the purposes of this workshop is to really say, as performers, we love collaborating with the composer. We like working with and communicating, and really, what is the composer's vision? What are they looking for? And then we will do our best to help find that vision. And because at the end of the day, we want to do our best job as string players playing the composer's music, and we want to feel like we understand it, that we own it, that we're comfortable playing it. And if sometimes if you have a non-string player playing and it's like, this is it, do it. I don't care if it's playable. I don't care if it's comfortable. I don't care. Just sit down. And it can make it really, really frustrating to play. And you feel like you're in a straitjacket, and it makes it much more difficult to play. And ultimately, it's not a very pleasant experience, even if it's a great piece. So, it's the psychological aspect of this is really important. And so, because for me as a composer, I always want performers to bring themselves to the music. And I always try to allow the musicians to have some room for interpretation. And sometimes it's, that's exactly what I was looking for. And sometimes it's like, that's different, but I really like it. They're really making it work. Go for it, And you could be surprised in really pleasant ways. And sometimes you have to negotiate a little bit, and that's, and that's fine for all of us,
Well, this is where it's really useful to do the collaborative process, because I think it's really important. Like my approach as a composer is to try to put all the information that is necessary on the page, knowing that there's a certain degree of liberty. And then you get someone to play it, and then you go, okay, that's all of this is great, that's great, the interpretation, this is not exactly what I was thinking here, but it's really great. And then there's a spot where you go, they're really not getting it, I needed to put this marking or these dots here, or there's something specific I needed.
Yeah.
So kind of doing this exercise of putting what you think is necessary on the page, getting us to play it as our interpretation of it, and then you really notice where you need to add, where you need to remove, what you did well already. So that's where that two-step process. It's not this thing about like you write it in your studio, by candlelight, and then you bring it and it's perfect, right?
Yeah.
That's not the process.
No, and that's where
It never was, right? And we have this image of that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, we have plenty of examples of composers or not string players collaborating with string players to find that beautiful balance. Yeah. And the number, I mean, we know many of the greatest cello concertos were written not by cellists, but a composer who was working with a cellist. Yeah. And like Dvorak, you put a great composer and he had a great cellist working with him, and the result was magic.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, okay. A couple more bowing techniques. Jeté. Who would like to demonstrate jeté?
That guy. No.
Yeah, so it's a very cool technique, and it can definitely be very effective, and it depends very virtuosic also. It has to be fast, so that's one of the things with jeté, or also known as thrown bow. So we can do it as slow as maybe. So you might want to do it at 120 BPMs, kind of situation. And again, very virtuosic. You can use it as an accompaniment to a beautiful melody. Just having one of the instruments or two people doing some sort of to support the main line.
We get a lot of that actually in concertos. Violin concertos do a lot. Mendelssohn Violin Concerto comes directly to mind. Has passages like that.
Yeah.
And just kind of it's like a little bit of articulation with chord structure, like Alex was demonstrating there.
Yeah, and it can be also done. It doesn't have to be in 4/4. It can also be in kind of a. But usually the effect is the bouncing.
I think the most important thing about that is to know what is available to us in terms of making that technique work. So if you write two notes on the same string, and you can't play it any other way, then it really disturbs that ability to just put one note on every single string. So if I double it up, like it really just disturbs the flow. So
Yeah.
But as far as that technique is concerned as well, just like jeté, like it can just be on the one note, right? Like it doesn't need to be in that context.
Or just a glissando. You know, just glissando going down.
Right.
So it's really,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's really easy. That's a really easy effect, but it sounds really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this also brings up a really good point, is that the way you write for a soloist in a concerto or a solo piece versus how you write for orchestra strings or a string quartet, there are differences. That certain techniques are extremely difficult and require a lot of practicing. So when you're writing in concerto, usually your soloist is going to have significant time to practice, so you could you're showing off, and that's the time to really challenge them. But if you're writing an orchestra piece, players just don't have that kind of hours. They're expected to go through so much repertoire every week of your life. You just don't have hours and hours and hours and hours and weeks and months to learn one orchestra piece, or to learn, very rarely to write at that difficulty level for a string quartet, because it just the realities of making a living. We just could only throw so much time at a piece of music. So it's something to be very much aware of when you are composing.
I would just like to add one of the composers that you could study is Shostakovich's string quartets, because he actually came up with a really cool idea of having cadenzas within the quartet. Notably in the ninth string quartet, he actually just each instrument gets a solo, which is a little bit strange and quite original, because you would expect four people to play together most of the time, but he actually gives the spotlight on one particular instrument at a time. And so this is where you can get a little bit more ambitious with the soloistic approach to the instrument, maybe give them a chance to showcase whether it's the depth of the cello and viola, or maybe some of the more virtuosic passages on violin, or vice versa. So there's definitely a lot of possibilities there, and I highly recommend studying his quartets for this inspiration.
Absolutely, yeah. The Shostakovich is some of the greatest string quartets ever written. And I'd like to echo that as a composer, I think it's good to change textures. And I think a lot of composers feel, I'm writing a quartet, I have to have all four players playing all the time. And I think that changing the texture at time is a really good idea to add variety, because the strings tend to have the same sound. So having a solo and having one or all of the players having a chance to do a little cadenza, a little solo, having sometimes textures of just one person, 2, 3, and then just changing it up a little bit. It's a really easy way and a great way to add contrast and color to your music. So I certainly recommend something to consider.
I would also if I can just throw it in real quick, just to note that like our functions as first and second violin don't need to be harmony melody. Just if we're talking about like the solo and passing around, like we can all be melody, we can all be harmony, and so it's just nice to. I mean, I particularly love that as I play a lot of second violin, and I love to have a melody. So.
Yeah, absolutely, and you should be thinking that way. You should be sharing the wealth and let everyone have a little solo at some point. I mean, like the American quartet starting off with that viola solo. It's just so perfect hearing that viola color at the beginning. It just and then when the first violin comes in, it's so effective again with the color and the textures. So I'm a big fan of the viola, and it's like, give the viola player a solo. Don't put them in, we don't want to be like Lully, who felt that writing viola parts was beneath his dignity. So whenever he'd write a piece, he'd write out all the parts except the viola parts and give it to the copyist and say, well, you write it because I'm too good to write viola parts. So, the viola joke started hundreds of years ago. And then, it's great. Then Rameau came along and said, well, that became the tradition. Well, the great man, the Lully, was the top guy. And then Rameau came along and said, even though it's a Lully thing, I have to be in control. I'm going to write my own viola parts. I think the violas are important, and I don't want someone else writing my viola parts.
But speaking about writing parts, this is a really interesting topic to me personally, because we have encountered countless scores where we felt that there wasn't really a need for the fourth instrument. And I know this might sound a little philosophical maybe, but one thing that doesn't always work is unisons, especially in string quartet settings. And speaking of voicing and voices, so there's nothing wrong if you feel a three-part harmony, and even if it lasts for 20 bars, 25 bars, the whole movement, it really, if this is your vision, if this is what works, there's no reason to necessarily add the fourth instrument and double, because it's just a tuning nightmare, and it doesn't really contribute to the sound in general, because you have two people doubling one voice. And we have really encountered a lot of these situations where we felt like maybe this particular phrase can be just done on three instruments, or maybe just on two instruments. So, and unless you want to add a fourth color where one of the instruments is maybe doing a tremolo of sorts, or different kind of contribution, maybe a different effect to do. So definitely something that there's nothing wrong with.
We'll hear some of that.
To say the exact opposite of what you're saying as well, we've encountered a lot of times where we get to this like climactic moment, and we all have a downbeat except for the second violin, and we're like, why aren't you participating? Like, this is the moment. This is where we're heading. We were talking about that today.
Yeah, we were
in rehearsal,
Yeah.
and we were going like, why is this lacking? Like the buildup is there, so utilize everything you've got to make that work, even if that means that you play the downbeat and then change functions immediately to play a different kind of line or jump to a different register or whatever. Because it doesn't feel great to have these moments. I mean, it doesn't work well from the audience side, but also for us, like we want to be involved in those moments. Right?
Yeah.
It's about. I think there's also like this balance of like, I think knowing when that it's okay to drop voices and to give breaks and all that stuff. But also, I think if you're like a brass or wind player, coming from that world, from writing brass quintets and woodwind quintets, like we don't need the break. Yeah. So if you need us to play the entire time, we can.
Yeah.
So there's a certain element of like earning the moment. So if you earn the moment, or if you're led to the moment where it's going to be a little duet inside the quartet, then that's beautiful. But feeling like you need to put that in and give us a break feels sometimes artificial, and sometimes we'll go like, this feels like the composer never finished writing the second violin part. And we've encountered that where it kind of like just stops, and we're using we play off of scores, and so we get this like blank all of a sudden in the middle of the score, and we go, well, why? Right? So that's like those are moments that aren't earned, right?
Yeah. Well, I would suggest as a composer that when you hit your climax, whether it's in a string quartet, any piece, or an orchestra pieces, that's the point where you want everyone playing, and everyone comes together, and it's like, here it is. This is the moment. If you want a big climax in your piece, it's really important that you use all the resources available to do it. And sometimes that even means if it's the right context, you have players playing double stops or chords where you have four players and you just could get a wall of sound, and that could be really a really cool effect.
So one of the things that we do constantly when we get new works is like, if let's say that you need 5 voices in this one chord or whatever, it doesn't have to be like 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 is in this first violin, because those 2 notes might be really awkward. And so we often find these double stops, and then we go, okay, Alex, can you take this note and I'll take that note, and we just redistribute. So you get all the same notes, but you put them in a more comfortable context. Now, we can't expect all of the composers to know how everything feels, but and again, that's where the feedback in that workshop process is really useful.
Yeah.
But we were doing that today. Just on
Yeah, we were,
chords.
and this is definitely something that very particularly we want to avoid certain double stops on our string instruments, such as fifths, and we want to try to keep
Sometimes. Except for open strings.
Yep. So let's.
Cello.
So this, let's finish. We're almost there. So let's finish up with the bowing, and then we'll get into the left-hand technique stuff. But one point I think it's really important, whether it's writing for a quartet or any ensemble, really avoid having two violins playing in unison. Two violins playing in unison does not blend well. It's a nightmare trying to play in tune and together. It's very difficult, and it doesn't work. You're better off just having one player. Now, in an ensemble, a bigger ensemble, then having three players starts to blend, and four is better. And the more, that four sounds quite good. Six is even richer. And then, of course, if you have 12, 14, 16 violins playing the same, then it's incredibly rich. But two, not so much. So in a quartet, you really avoid having two violins playing in unison. Now, that said, if you add a third player, you add viola or cello, the four of you playing in unison, now that's a really cool sound because you're hearing a little cello and viola with the two violin sound. So it creates a whole new kind of color, and it could sound very dramatic. So that works really well. So three or four, great technique, but two violins, really stay away from that. Okay, now a couple more techniques. Legno, this is playing with the wood of the bow. Generally, string players, we don't like it because our bows are expensive and they're fragile. So if we're whacking the wood of the bow, it could mark it up and damage it. So very often, if we have a piece, especially in the orchestra where there's a lot of legno, we'll bring our cheap bows or our carbon fiber bows and use that so that we don't damage our bows. So just be aware. It's a cool effect, but
yeah. So it sounds a little something like. So you can actually hear the pitches very, very little, but
I feel like you hear
maybe
more
on
on cello or
there's
bass.
There's a few of those, and we'll talk about some of the others. But
Way more pitch.
You'll get a lot more.
yeah. So it's a cool effect.
And one of the things that I like to do that it's if it's a particularly harsh section, and I don't know that it works as well on the other instruments, maybe on the viola. Certainly on basses it works nicely. It's when you do legno sul tasto, and then you get to hit the fingerboard, which is really it's a lot
But that's when you bring your cheaper bow.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you don't do that with an expensive French bow. You bring in your carbon fiber. But yeah,
Exactly.
but you could do really cool things
But
with
the
that.
cool thing about that
Absolutely.
is that actually it sounds like you're damaging it a lot more than you are. Because if you're getting that same tone where there's no fingerboard, you have to whack it. But here the idea is basically, so I'm not damaging my finger really by doing this. And so, that's the cello. So I'm actually not whacking it, I'm actually whacking it less hard. And the string is softer here than it is here. So I'm actually doing a lot less physical damage to the bow. So it's just an extra.
I do not think that. I mean, I feel like violinists are less inclined to do that. We also don't have a lot of wood, as much wood as you guys do.
Yeah.
The fingerboard is also mine's gonna be wackier because it can move.
It's way. Yeah.
This brings up another really good point. Again, discussion, collaboration. If you're writing for Sam, he's into it, so he'll go for it. Other string players get really uptight, and they'll say, "I'm not going to play it. I'm not going to play it." Yeah.
Right. So where you thought you were going to get this really hard thing, then
So this is where communication is critical, because some string players are really into special effects and extended techniques, and they're like, "Bring it on," and others get very uptight about it. And so you want to have that. You always want to have that conversation. Same thing about improvisation. Some string players will be really into it, and others like, I don't do that. Sorry, not going to happen. So these are things you always need to talk about with your performers. Next thing, sul ponticello, which is playing right on the bridge, right, very close, and gets a very harsh nasal sound. Can be very effective, either very softly or loudly.
But what's interesting about, before you demonstrate the first thing, is that it is very much open to discussion how much pitch you want to get. Yeah. And this is an incredibly fascinating discussion to me, because let's try very little pitch.
So like right on the bridge. This is like taking very literally.
Can you play a melody of sorts?
Oh, sure.
Now let's try as much pitch as possible.
What's that?
As much pitch as possible.
Okay, so now I'm like getting a little bit away from the bridge, but I'm still very close. And so you're starting to hear the upper harmonics a lot. You're getting this really nasally sound out of it as well. But certainly, if you write molto sul pont, we'll be inclined to almost go right on the bridge, which is, to be quite honest, pretty silent. Like I'm not playing any. Right, you're going to get that white noise, which you can indicate as well. But
I would say if you're writing this option though, which is right on top of the bridge, the faster it is, the more technically challenging it becomes. Because we're already working within a very small margin of how far to the bridge we're playing. And so the faster that goes, the more likely we are to maybe come in and out of that. Yeah. So the slower it is, or the more sustained it is, the easier it is to.
But not to be confused with there's nothing wrong. It's actually the best when
tremolo is different.
Tremolos is not, to us, is not fast, right? We're not that, so that sul pont trem is a fantastic thing to put in.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, and another string technique, tremolo.
Sorry, we didn't talk about that, but yeah.
But yeah, I mean, tremolo is something that's very easy, standard, and can be very effective.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one thing though, sul pont, not with the mute on, because the mute is on the bridge. Right. So don't try to get fancy and write sul pont, consort.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Good, yeah, and of course mutes. If you want a softer, more muted sound, it's great. Now, something that we've been seeing quite a bit as we've been recording new Canadian pieces is when we go from arco to pizz, it takes a second to move from one position to another. And we've been seeing pieces where there's no rest. And so can we just demonstrate? Now, the bigger their instrument, basses take more time than anything because that's such a big instrument. You really got to give them a couple of beats. But for the rest of the string instruments, usually if you give us a beat, we're good, a beat or two. But we do need a little bit of
We have a
time.
very good example for this, where the first violin, you'll see that the middle voices put their bows down, I think, at the beginning. If I'm...
He does.
Oh, the cellist does,
Yeah,
yes.
he does.
Because Sam doesn't need to play for a little while. But I will keep...
Which is something that I would never write as a composer. The composer should never tell you to put the bow down. That's what we decide to do.
So you will see how I transition from the pizzicato to the arco, and how much time I get to do that. So I had about half a bar to get to the arco, and that felt good for me to go from one to the other.
And that was the second movement of Ravel's string quartet, one of my favorite. It's a masterpiece, and a quartet I always recommend to younger composers if they're learning how to compose for a quartet. Look at that one. It's very colorful. Really exploits the instruments extremely well.
So we have a really cool passage. So we're going to show something. Just the violins are going to play a little passage to show you how he wasn't as kind to us always, just like he was on the first page. So on the second page, we have a moment where we are doing a lot of acrobatics. Ready? So we had an
back and
8-note rest to jump from one to the other. So we tried our best. We played on an up bow. 1, 2, 3, 1. And it's quite challenging because I have to jump from a triple stop, which is almost always out of tune, unfortunately. But I'm counting on cello covering me there. So 1, 2, 3. We have a very prominent line to play I'm the main voice, and if I don't land on that note nicely, you don't really hear the beginning, so it's quite nerve-wracking to play this.
I think we all sweat when that, or we both sweat when that happens. Not that it's impossible, it is doable, but I think if this were prolonged then more than 1, 2, 3, 4 bars, I might have some issues.
And also, I mean, again, we get into this like really technical context with our instruments where, like, if you're writing, right, like that, we can do that because we've got an open string, I can pluck it with my left hand, no problem. But as soon as it's, like, that one's a lot more awkward. So the context of that depends. Also, like, there can be those moments where I do that, I'll let go of my thumb, where I can then pluck it easily.
We cannot do that.
No, exactly. That's what I mean. It's like the context really depends.
Yeah, because sometimes if we have an open string, we could pluck it with the left hand.
Yes,
And
open
then
strings
Or the
are
cellist
not as
will
bad.
No, I'm kidding.
So, yeah, there's tricks that
Yeah. So I mean, it's like there's a certain confidence that you almost have to exude as a composer on the page for us to see how necessary that is and how much work we have to do to achieve it. And if it doesn't feel like that, and if basically we also basically come up with, like, if we can come up with a different solution, then we'll go with that. But sometimes there's these things, and like Ravel is a good example of, like, this is hard, but make it work, right? Like there's that, because you kind of see that confidence, especially in the context. Can we just play with the context?
yeah, well, you see his vision. He has a vision, and it makes sense, and so you go for it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fine.
So
No,
we get,
it's okay.
it's really cool, and actually it reminded me of Catherine's piece that we recorded last year, Catherine Petkovsky's piece, where we, for the first time, I had an opportunity to injure my instrument a little bit, in a good way, not injure, but have fun with the percussive part of it, because when you think about the pizzicato, it is very percussive, and it is a cool thing, right? So you hear a little bit of that percussion in it, and what Catherine wrote was very interesting. I played so it was used very nicely where we, sorry about that, where we find the part of the instrument that resonates most. Again, cello is far superior to this.
That was a big learning curve as well, because I wasn't sure of that at that point, but given the chance to do it again, I would definitely put the knock in the cello.
Yeah, and
To
there's
make
so
more
many more,
resonant.
like, there's a lot of different spots that we can hit on the cello. It's
Way
like
more
it's almost
potential.
it's more like a cajon.
Like the bigger the gourd, the more resonance you get.
Yeah,
So.
exactly.
When it's great with the string orchestra, to
Oh,
you know, to have sections where you could have the cellos and basses do these cool percussive things, knocking on the instrument, and
You got into the extended technique. It wasn't very.
yeah, no, it's great. And then typical extend techniques is playing on the other side of the bridge, bowing the tail, and there's all kinds of things that we could do. So again, if your players are into that, ask, and then go crazy. And if they're really, some players are just not comfortable doing extended techniques, and if you make them do it, they'll either refuse to play it or not be very happy. And
Or we can talk about it.
you never want to have your players kind of sitting there looking like, oh God, it's really, this is, I mean, we mask it better than that, but it's inside sitting there and go, oh, why am I doing this piece,
No, but our instruments are pretty resilient. So, and we can use a nail versus knocking. So, very different sound, right? and there's also these things where we can hit the chin rest, and as Sam was showcasing all different kind of things. But we're always open to discussion on these things, and as you said,
I wrote a piece where, and again, this is a carbon fiber bow kind of moment, but I had the cellist.
My heart.
Yep. Well, I have to say that the Odin Quartet, you guys are some of the most open-minded, flexible string players in quartet that I know. You just will take on any challenge and go for it, and I think that's really one. And then why you're getting such a great reputation for playing Canadian music. Okay, and one last point before we go on to left hand, but bowing is important, is the faster the tempo goes, the less options you have with trying to do intricate bowings. You know, if it's going really fast, separate or 4 notes slurred, maybe 8 notes, but trying to do really like 3 notes slurred and 1 short, you know, at a certain speed, you just can't do it. Now, a slower speed, 1, 2, 3, you know, 3 notes slurred and the 4th note short, works, you know, or 2, very common. But if you're going super fast, you just can't do really intricate things where you're changing, you know, you slurs 2 notes and separate, you know, this and that, and you know, if you get too crazy, you just can't do it.
Yeah, there's a lot of that actually in that same movement of Revel for myself and Matt. It makes me sweat just a little bit more. It's a little tricky to do. Like I really have to like think about that. And the second that I have a moment where I can use an open string or some other string, I'll take that over. I need that relief of something.
If Ravel was a composer that was alive now and bringing us this piece, you would definitely ask the question of, maybe we'll do slur by 4, right? Like that would be the question we ask in the reading.
Yeah,
it's still a little bit weird for my left hand, but I mean, it's not as bad.
Another question we could ask is, okay, you want this triad or this chord, but can we change the order? Because sometimes, and this is a really, again, to me, fascinating discussion, because if it's just an effect, so maybe versus it might just be easier for us to play. And if the composer doesn't really, if it doesn't matter to the composer that it's that exact order of notes in that exact order, then we have actually changed things to make it. Sometimes we'll even make it more complex sounding, but it's going to be easier for us to play. And we've also gone from things sounding a little too easy for what they should be. And we'll see the disappointment in a composer. They write stuff for us that they say, it's just not quite right, I'm not getting that. I said, well, what if I did it in double speed? And then suddenly they say, oh my God, like that's exactly what I want. I want that intricacy and the rhythmical structure. So, but in Tanya's case, obviously, who knows what it is that we would have found with Mr. Maurice to find the right amount of activity with least amount of sweating.
I think it involves the left hand, which is like actually a nice segue too, like just knowing what to put in there to make it happen or not.
Yeah.
Right, it can really make a difference.
When I should also mention that at a fast tempo, slurring in groups of 2 is actually quite difficult to play. You know, separate notes, 4 slurred, no problem. But if you have da-da-da-da-da-da, you know, it's actually really hard to control that.
I feel like 3 is not as bad, but 2 is...
2 could be really, really tough.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these are all the subtleties. And, you know, like if you don't know all this, you know, ask your players and they'll tell you, and it makes everyone happy. Okay.
Before we go to the left hand, I just want to mention one thing that we were talking about solpant, and we didn't really talk about tasto.
Yes, thank you.
Fingerboard. The one thing that I see a lot in new music is the concept that, or the thought that, while it's technically true that we play somewhere in between the bridge and the end of the fingerboard, and that playing solpant is going one way and soltasto is going the other way. Sonically, tasto and pont are not opposites. And so doing this like shift of going pont to tasto to pont, and sometimes you'll even see that where they'll do like, where we'll switch, but it actually is a less effective tool than even just going pont to normale. Actually going the extra step to go tasto doesn't really give, there's not as much, let's put it this way, there's not as much difference between normale and tasto than there is between normale and pont.
Absolutely.
And
yeah,
so I think there's, because of the technique of it, there's this idea that they're opposites and that they're like contrasting things, but they're not. So tasto is really just a different color of regular bowing. It's almost akin to putting on a mute, whereas ponticello is a completely different color.
And
Yeah.
also with sol tasto, I can't speak for the cello, but the higher up, and we'll talk about left hand stuff in a second, but the higher up in position that we get, the harder it is to be tasto. I mean, there's a couple of reasons why, and it's mostly just because it gets in the way of our sounding point of just actually being able to make a pitch, because we're making the string like shorter, so we want to actually have the bow closer to our face, so to be tasto at the same time kind of deadens the effect of that a little bit. But also, especially on for us on the higher string, if we're tasto and in position, it actually presses the string down towards the fingerboard. So it makes it almost impossible to do that anyway, because it gets in the way of the body, our bow, so then we can't actually play. So just things to think about.
Yeah,
as well.
absolutely. And I'm going to get a little technical as I tend to do, but I'm going to try to keep it short. Which is basically the idea is that when we're playing the string, we're playing close to the bridge because we're playing the string, and the part that's vibrating the most is right in the middle. And so when we play tasto, we're basically playing a little bit higher up, away from where that is, and kind of dampening the vibrations. But now I'm playing an open string, and I'm playing right here. If I go up here, now the percentage of where that bow is compared to the blocked spot is much greater. Right now I'm actually at 50%, and that's akin to me playing right here, which sounds really difficult because basically the place that's vibrating the most is being stifled by the bow. So that's why the context. Actually, when you're way up here, we're practically playing like ponticello. My spot where I'm playing, if I was playing that open string, I'm actually playing ponticello.
Yeah.
So it's all proportionate.
Yeah.
And so I think if it's high, writing tasto is a big problem. In fact, we're just going to be playing in a regular spot. It'll just mean play less good. Right?
Like flotando.
Yeah,
would almost make the same effect at that point. At that point.
Well, so playing over the fingerboard is something that Debussy and Ravel brought in the orchestra pieces when they really want virtually no sound, because it's if you're kind of very neutral and very soft, you could play over the string and it makes over the bridge, over the fingerboard and play extremely softly. But as far as for quartet or solo playing, you have to be very careful to make that.
I think there's also the physical aspect of when you're writing sol tasto, what it technically means, it means over the fingerboard, as you pointed out. And our fingerboard ends at a certain spot, and so as we're moving up, we feel bound by that spot.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't give us that flexibility or the impression of flexibility to move up with it. So, anyways, not to put too fine.
Yes, but I mean, one point that's really important for composers to know is that your bow placement on the string varies depending on how low or high you're playing. Yeah. If you're playing on the C string, you can't play next to the bridge, or else it's just going to have a sol pont sound. Where if you're playing way up high, you have to get right next to the bridge because you need a certain amount of room for the string to vibrate. So there are all these complexities that as string players we learn over the years, and I hope this is interesting for our composers. So let's talk a little bit about the left hand. So in its simplest form, we're either playing in a position or we're shifting from one position to another. When you're shifting between positions, this is difficult, and if this is where if a string player is going to make a mistake or play a little out of tune, it's going to be when you're shifting. So as a composer, you want to not go hog wild with the shifting when you're because if it gets too crazy, then it makes it extremely difficult to play. Because generally, what we try to do as string players, we try to shift as little as possible and the smallest distance possible, so you don't hear the shifts, and that we could control what we're doing. So probably one of the hardest things technically and most risky thing, if someone composer has us play a very low note on the instrument and then go boom, bang, and just
Yeah,
trying to
that
hit
is me in
extremely high note. And even worse, if you have two notes like a chord and trying to get that, like on cello, it's basically you're playing, a slot machine, and you're probably not going to win. It's really risky. So it's very, don't do that. It's very stressful, and your odds of hitting it, unless you don't care, unless it's just like, just slam any note, and that's different. But if you want a particular pitch, don't jump. Well, just show them going from a low note to a very high
As
note.
in slur, like
No, just go boom, beam.
Like, so if I'm going to try to do 2 octaves.
No, shifting is different. But I'm just saying, you hit a note and then you just
Do the
jump and hit
corresponding
another
reveal.
note.
So
So it's like a rest between.
I'm just going to play this note. I'm
Yeah.
going to try to play 2 octaves above, and whatever. No. I mean, it's getting
Disappointing.
really difficult there. I mean, the octave above, it's
not too
somewhat,
bad.
I can guess it.
Oh,
And you see,
that's pretty
Sam is
good.
measuring. Like we do a lot of
Yeah.
measurements. It's not like we're jumping around random. At least we try to teach ourselves not to do that.
Yeah.
But the more distance you put between those 2 points, and say you don't give us enough time to do that, the more we sweat.
Yeah, that's right. Now, a different thing is if you want to hear the slide and you're going from one note to another note, well, you actually could hear the pitch as you're sliding,
That's
and if you give you give the performer a little time,
Is great.
just dig it, and
live
now
for
you
that.
could hear the shift, and you know where you could control that. But if you just go dum, bang, just stop.
But as you pointed out, I mean, if it's like
Yeah.
that's not a problem. 'Cause
Random,
It's just
It doesn't
a
matter
random
what-
note,
yeah.
but yeah.
But if you want a particular piece,
Yeah.
but and so that with shifting generally, the way we string players play in today's world, we try to hide shifts unless there's a particular we want to bring out that element. Now it's interesting that 75, 100 years ago, if you listen to old recordings like Rachmaninoff playing his own piano concerto, you hear the string players putting these huge portamentos and glissandos in just normal melodic phrases, because that was at that point that was considered being musical. And now in today's world, we like our string player playing generally cleaner. So you're not going to hear among standard rep these big, huge glissandos and slides the same way you would have 100 years ago. But for contemporary composer, that's a different thing. If you want a big glissando or portamento, the difference is portamento is just a little slide, and a gliss is like, we want to hear that. That's okay. And, that's totally
And
okay.
sometimes we will intuit even where you don't think you need it or want it, and put it there. And then you can have the choice to tell us to take it out. But
Ravel does a really fascinating thing, actually. Find the letter I in the first moment. He trades. This is exceptionally cool, but absolutely nerve-wracking and somewhat unnecessary.
Oh, yeah.
So what he does, this is awesome.
Yeah.
So he gives first violin 2 bars really high, and he gives the same thing to the second violin while we trade, and then we play really low while the other person is playing high. There was absolutely no reason. So this is what he could have written. Let me just demonstrate on my
sure.
own. So.
Let me play it with you. Play with you as
Yeah,
one part.
so this is what he should have written. So you see I'm on E string, I have one shift, right? So it's pretty comfortable. But he decided to do this. Because he was all about his color, right? Like
It's terrifying. It's terrifying.
So we are supposed to sound similar with the colors that we bring, but of course we have different instruments. So there is something going on there, and it's pretty magical, but we are both in absolute horror to reach this high note. We go all the way down. And then this note is somewhere here. They're never really 100% sure. Okay, it's gonna be a G flat, let's hope for the best and hit this note. So we do all sorts of maneuvering, and we practiced it a lot, obviously, together to really go up. But he could have made it much easier for us, but for some reason, he didn't.
Well, I think he liked challenging his musicians.
No kidding.
And yeah, his a lot of his music is really, but it's such great music. Players play the music, and one thing I tell young composers that if you're a genius, then you could write something crazy difficult, and people will spend huge amounts of time to learn it. But if it's not a masterpiece, even if it's really, really good, it's gonna probably not get played very often because reality, we just don't have the time. So it's definitely something to consider. Now, all the string instruments can play double stops and chords. Now, double stops, if one of the notes is an open string, it's easy. But now, otherwise, this is where you need to do a little homework about what double stops work, what chords work. A quick thing is if you could have some open strings in your chord, that works really well. The typical thing is if you have the two bottom strings are open, you get a fifth, and then you put a six on the top. Very easy to do. Double stops, you see for in solo music, parallel intervals, like groups of thirds, six are common, especially six work really well on the cello. Octaves, I mean, these are things, but they're difficult to play. They do take practice, but a couple of them, parallel six or thirds or octaves are, all doable.
So one thing that off the bat is that try not to give double stops to each instrument. As cool as it would be, and as amazing it would be, because then we have an octet, right? Maybe try to challenge one or two people at a time together, because then they'll be maybe struggling to get it in tune, but the other two will be in tune for sure. So if you give, we have played many pieces where we all play double stops, and it's been very challenging because then you're tuning to yourself and to another person and to another person while they're also tuning another person. Yeah. So there is so many things going on, and then you're not even sure anymore, are you in tune with yourself and with the other person? So there's just too many things going on, and it is pretty magical when it works. But and as Mr. Rohr said, it's really wonderful to us when we see that open string, because then it's that much easier for us to just add that extra note to the chord and make it that much more potent and strong. So that being said, you have to do a little bit of homework on what works with what, and sixths are great, thirds are okay.
I'd say generally there's just because you're picking out certain intervals, I sort of tend to think of it as closed hands and open hands. So closed hands would make my hand sort of do this, which is not really a comfortable, I shouldn't say comfortable, but just it's not a natural position for a hand to sit in. I don't naturally have my hand this way. So that is kind of anything that's below a fifth looks like this. Anything that's above a fifth looks like this. So I'd rather do something not like this, right? Doesn't mean they're impossible, but when they're consecutive, it just requires us to be a little bit more careful, whereas that might just feel a little bit more natural.
Yeah, great point. Same on the cello.
Yeah, exactly. The handshake thing definitely applies. And I think if you're writing chords, by all means write what you think is appropriate, but if you can have a discussion with a string player, it can be really useful. Because there's things that it's just impossible for me to give a rule, but if I was doing a B minor 9 chord where I'm playing the tonic, the third, and the 9, that's fine, but then the 9 actually requires the same finger, but I can't block the middle string. So I have to do this weird thing where I change that shape, and even worse if I'm playing a note in the middle, but if that note is above that where my finger is, I can flatten that finger and put a finger on top. Right. So there's so many contexts that it's impossible to give rules. And if there's an open string, then all of a sudden it's better. So just have a discussion with the string player, and this is where Dvorak would have, or did have all those really intricate conversations with the cellist, right, to make it all work. And the Dvorak is a brilliantly written piece of cello.
Because it's also not just the double stop of the chord, but it's going into it and coming out of it is really critical.
And also the distance of which you're writing. So Octaves are fine, I think, across the board. Ninths are when you start to think, is it possible? I don't think it's like, I mean, we do ninths, it's not a big deal. But when we get to tenths, it's like, you don't want to write anything bigger than that for violin.
Yeah.
We already hate tenths.
Yeah.
Like they look kind of gross. Like if I have to land something like this in a hard passage and you throw a tenth in there, that's what it's going to look like. It doesn't feel very good.
Yeah.
So like if you're approaching a tenth, like sustain it, you know, approach it with care, exit with care. But I wouldn't put them as frequently because it does require some gymnastics.
Yeah.
If there's an open string involved, great. If not,
Yeah,
then you need the gymnastics.
Tenth close to first position is definitely much further than if you're a little higher up. Although then, of course, tuning becomes
Right.
Yeah, and for those of you who are not string players, in case you don't know, the notes get closer together the higher you go up.
Right.
So on the cello, half step could be, this far apart, and in the higher up there, the fingers are overlapping.
Sorry. So let me do it a second time. So that's my distance. If I were to maintain that same distance and go all the way up, it's a third now. So that was a semitone down there. Now it's a third, and I didn't change that distance.
Yeah.
So that it's just, again, it's a percentage of the string.
And that, of course, makes it challenging to play because it's not like a piano where the notes are the same distance. It's changing all over the instrument, and you're adapting very quickly. So
I wouldn't write tenths for the cello down here, but you can up here. I mean, it's very soloistic, so I would like in a quartet setting be very specific if you know what you're doing and stuff. But even with the cello, one thing that's really important to note, depending on your hand size, octaves. So I can do the octave by stretching my hand, basically.
It freaks me out.
by using these fingers, but many cellists will have to bring up their thumb to play octaves. So that means that you need that extra time to do that.
Yeah.
So even if someone can do it, and I mean, if you have smaller hands, you're used to making those adaptations. So I don't want to make anyone with a smaller hand feel like they are less adequate than anybody else, because they will. It's very impressive, and we've certainly both been in those situations, even with larger hands, where you have to bring your thumb up like that. But just to be aware that the difference between all of a sudden calling octaves for you guys versus us. In fact, you've got it in a position, whereas your 1 to 4 is an octave.
It's there. Yeah.
Whereas our 1 to 4 is a seventh, a minor seventh.
So all this comes to the conversation of voicing. So if you're really about these octaves, if you really want to hear the fortified melody, maybe consider giving it to the other instrument to support the main one. Maybe you want to have the viola and first violin together. Maybe you want to have cello and viola together in octaves, rather than one person trying to play octaves. So it really depends what you're trying to convey, what message. And but ideally, stay away from double stops unless it's something that you really believe in and it's doable on the instrument. Otherwise,
Enhancing.
Yeah, and ask a string player. I want to talk a little bit about vibrato. Generally, we use vibrato because it brings the sound alive. It's a very expressive technique. But a good string player is always changing the vibrato depending on the context. Sometimes a little wider, sometimes it's a little narrower, sometimes a little faster, sometimes a little slower. So it's changing all the time. And even on the same note, a lot of times you'll hear a player start off with no vibrato and then warm it up and then let the note grow if you're coming from nothing to something. So does someone want to demonstrate that technique of going from no vibrato to letting it bloom, so to speak? And I should also say sometimes we won't use vibrato, but that's usually where the composer wants to notate that. You say sends the vibrato. If you want a fairly cold, unemotional sound, you'll have sends of vibrato, and that could be very effective in contrast to the nice warmth of vibrato.
This is the third movement of Ravel Quartet. It starts like this. Oh, that was fun.
Wolf tone.
I usually start it without and then kind of warm it up.
So his vibrato is like, you know,
It's all over the
it's
place.
warm. No, well, it's flat and then it's warm. And if he were to play that with a quicker vibrato, it would sound really nervous.
Yeah.
And that's not the feeling we're trying to evoke. So that's kind of, you know, it's like if it's nervous or intense, it tends to be tighter. And if it's more relaxed, it tends to also relax.
So there's a whole world of vibrato that, you know, that the professionals use that really bring so much musicality to the image. It's like very expressive what Matt did, and where if it's just all the same, it was no vibrato, it would sound very flat, and if he had a big thick vibrato, it would sound like he was very uptight. So everything, you know, so anything is possible. Okay, time is kind of running out. We could probably, we love what we talk about, and we could talk all night. We want to talk a little bit about harmonics. This is the thing that I think is, for composers and performers, one of the challenges of how to notate harmonics. First of all, there's two different types. There's natural harmonics, where you just, all you have to do is not push down, but just touch the string. And then there's artificial harmonics. So can someone demonstrate both a natural harmonic?
So natural. Like they happen at specific spots too. But artificial, we have to block. It's like we're changing the string length with our lower finger and then creating like the node. So it enabled us to play scales, whereas this doesn't really get us as far. Those are all natural. So,
yeah. So with natural harmonics, generally it's simple. Wherever you want it to sound, you just notate it and put a little circle above the note. Artificial, very often I'll see composers put the pitch that it should sound, and that's actually confusing. It's much better to notate where you're playing it. So you should be seeing the fourth, the fundamental note where you push down, and then the fourth above where you're just touching the string, and that will sound 2 octaves above the lower note. Yeah. So that is preferred. String players will see that and they won't get confused. Now some composers, to be even more careful, and that's okay, is you'll have where it's played and then you'll also have the pitch where it sounds. And so that's really, you know, absolutely no question what to do.
Yeah, basically when you get there, you just want to write, imagine you're writing a note and you're writing 15 VA on top.
Yeah.
But don't write that. But that's basically the idea, right? Like if you write the pitch you want, then rewrite that where it's a 15 VA, and then you put a diamond note at a fourth above, whatever the fourth is. It has to be a perfect fourth. So if you're on a B, if you're on a whatever.
Yeah, B is good. It has to be an F sharp.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you
no,
can't.
not the F sharp. It has to be.
E. Sorry, E.
Yeah, so that's not a good example.
You mean like say C and F and don't write an F sharp?
Yeah, that's right. It has to be a perfect fourth.
It has to be a perfect fourth.
Has to be a perfect fourth.
The key signature doesn't matter. It's one of those things. It has to be a perfect fourth, and it's a diamond note on the top. Yeah. And if your MIDI sounds like fourths, just try to do your best to ignore it. You know. Yeah. It's one of those things.
Yep. But yeah, that's how you do it. I wanted to a couple of special effects. One that I really like on cello is the seagull effect.
Oh, they got to do it.
We got to do it. It was terribly hard.
They didn't know what it was.
No.
So basically, and this goes along with what I was saying with like this second minor second I was playing here becomes larger on top. So the idea, the effect here is that I'm not going to change. I'm going to do artificial harmonics, but I'm not changing the distance between my fingers. So what happens is you're basically hitting a bunch of different harmonics. I'll do a little bigger one. So because I'm not changing, it's grabbing different harmonics as we go. You can. Sorry, that one didn't work. No, I'm being too good. Okay. Now I'm not changing.
There you go. And that is specifically a cello thing that we struggled with because the string length really helps, and I guess the body as well, but like it doesn't work as well in violin. I feel like we struggled a bit and then we finally found it. But it happens over there.
We had it in a piece. You guys are 38 years old and you didn't know what it was. I'm just pointing out,
Yeah.
it's a cello and bass thing.
Yeah, but not all cellists know it either.
Sure.
Because I've written pieces with the seagull, and then the cellist says, "What is that?"
I just
You
think
know,
it's one of
and
those
you know,
sound
it's
effects
oh,
that
you know,
cellists know how to do.
and I'll demonstrate, and they go, "Oh, cool, that's cool." But
Yeah.
you know, it's not something that's it's easy. And then it brings me into the next topic is microtones, and you know, it's important for composers to realize that playing in microtones is not part of our education. It is very, very rare that anyone teaches. You know, it's so much effort to learn how to just play in, you know, half steps and to play beautifully in the bowing and the left hand, that it's not part of our training. And as such, you have people who really like new music, and they've worked at it and they're good at it and they're comfortable playing quarter tones, and there's other string players who's like, no, not happening, not going to do it. They're not comfortable, they haven't done it, they say, I don't have the time to do it. So again, this is one of those conversations you want to have with your performers. If you want to write quarter tones, are you comfortable doing that? And if they say no, don't push it, because you're just going to get, you're going to just really anger your players. So these are really important conversations to have when you're composing for string players. Yeah, and any other comments on quarter tones or?
Depending on on the concept, we can do it, and I think it's very effective if can you hold D and G and D strings?
Sure.
So I'm going against what I hear for Sam. Now, if the composer writes two or three of us to play microtones or quarter tones, then it might be difficult, because then we are tuning again to each other or not. So it's not a bad idea maybe to give one person a little solo and to try to work with this. But as Mr. Royer is saying, is that it is a very niche thing, and you might need to venture more into world music. And whatever world music means, it can mean a lot of things. But you might want to look into certain traditions of playing this, and there's experts. And as string players and as classically trained, traditionally, we don't learn this unless we have personal experience or willingness to really get and delve into this world of.
I think what's important to remember, because we did have this composition once where we had quarter tones written in, and it was to tell us how to function within a chord, as opposed to allowing us to just do our job, which is what is your function in the chord. We do that all the time. That is how we play as string players. So
microtones, not quarter tones, were written.
I think they were written as quarter tones, but you're right. It's more accurate that way.
Right. So like, if you're trying to tune us in a particular way, I wouldn't say that's a place to use it.
So if I could just jump on that. I think one thing that's worth mentioning, as a string quartet that is playing just the four of us, we don't play equal temperament.
Yes.
So our semitones are not all equal, and they will change context depending on the key we're playing, but depending on the chord and all of that stuff. So we will move a lot. So all of a sudden, when you're putting in the microtone, you're putting us in a place where we have to play equal temperament, which is fine, but it's just to be aware of that change. And that we might, if there's a microtonal section and there's a section that isn't, it doesn't mean we're going to stay equal temperament. We're going to go to where it feels right in the instrument and to our ears. If we're playing with piano, if there's a piano trio, for example, or piano quintet, let's say, when the piano is playing, we're always going to be equal temperament. But the moment they stop, you better believe we're not doing it.
Yeah.
So true.
So it's just important to know these things.
Yeah, and it's important to realize that for string players, and that an F sharp and a G flat are not exactly the same. On the piano, they're the same, but when it's a string player or a wind player, it's going to be, if you're a really good professional, it's going to be a different note, slightly different. So again, context is everything. In some contexts, quarter tones could be very doable. In other contexts, they could be a real challenge to try to do it. Okay, I just want to make a couple of overall notes. In the lower register, the standard register of any string instrument, we're really incredibly versatile and flexible. But when you get into the extreme high ranges, it gets incredibly much more difficult. And so you have to be very careful how you write in that context, because getting around is much, much more difficult. Okay? For fast tempos, use open strings, because if you could occasionally use open strings where you're flying around, again, much more agile than if every single note is fingered because you're in a key where you can't ever use an open string. Now, music that incorporates open strings, like a C major, D, G major, those type of things, where you have open strings, just the law of physics, it's going to have a lot more resonance in the sound and have a nice open ringing sound. Now, if you have a tonality where you're using lots of sharps or flats, it's going to have a very different sound. It's going to sound more covered, and so if you want that, both work. But if you want that kind of covered sound, then lots of sharps or flats are great. If you want a more open, rich, big sound, make sure you're using the open strings, because the instrument will sound and vibrate much more. Of course, each string, you probably know this, that each string has a different characteristic. The low string is much darker, and the highest string is much brighter. And it's also important to know that some scales are easier to play than others. Major and minor scales really fit well, and arpeggios fit under the fingers well, and we could really fly around and go very fast. If you want to go extremely fast, like octatonic scales, I personally love using octatonic scales, but they're a lot harder to play. They just don't fit under the fingers nearly as well. So, if the goal is to play as fast as possible, use a regular, use a scale that can do that. So all about context. As far as writing for quartet, we talked about avoiding having the two violins play in unison. Playing in octaves, on the other hand, works really well. So occasionally having the whole quartet play in octaves can be very effective. We talked about not having all four players playing all the time. And I think one area that, if you're not a string player, that you might want to consider is really think about using a whole range of articulations in your music, and realize there's a huge variety, as we brought out today, and that opens up a huge sound world for you to use when you're composing.
Yeah, if I may add, more is more. Give us all the information possible, and even if it's potentially obnoxious, we want to see, because we cannot guess what you think and what you feel. So we can't just think you put a pianissimo. You could write pianissimo sostenuto, you can write pianissimo dolce, you can write pianissimo many espressivo. So that way we will know what kind of pianissimo you're going for. So not just quiet. And we want to have this kind of information, because it's just so many times where the composer says, oh, I want it a little bit softer, I want it a little bit more expressive, and then we write it in ourselves, which is fine, of course, but we really cannot tell. And if I may ask also always as many accidentals as possible, because that really helps us. Courtesy
ones.
Yes.
That saves us from playing wrong notes. As simple as that, because our brains are wired in a way where we see the note and we just remember it. And it's one of those things where there's a little bit of that, I don't want to say dirty work, but like ugly work, where you just have to be precise with what you're writing, because you might be actually risking that we are playing the wrong note just because we saw, or just because we assume that maybe first movement you wrote pretty tonally, and then you decide to go atonal for the second movement, and then we really want to see what it is. There's also, Sam probably has to add to that with key signature versus no key signature.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty common now that, like, as a convention, that we tend to write no key signatures, just because of the palette of sound or of tonalities that we go to. I mean, I know that when I write, it changes about every 3 bars. So like if I were to put a key signature at the beginning, if you look at Strauss, like Richard Strauss is like, most of the time you can have a bar of flats when he's got 5 sharps in the key signature, and it's just it's fighting one another. So the convention now, no sharps does not mean C major. It's just kind of a blank palette that we use. So if you're putting a key signature, really mean it. Like that's because there's a real function, like you really want to, but it can just really fight against us.
If you notice that you are constantly writing sharps and adding flats and putting accidentals, that means that maybe you really didn't have to put the key signature, because we are never really in that key for the extended period of time, and it's actually tricky for us to remember. Wait, it was two sharps, right? Because the second sharp was not even used that much. So unless you're writing really tonal music and you're in this key of E major and it's mostly E major, then it's fine. So it is a fine balance, and it's maybe hard for you to tell what you should write. But lately, we've been appreciating getting scores with no key signature. But again, if you see yourself writing F sharp and C sharp, F sharp and C sharp, F sharp and C sharp, maybe it's time to make it this B minor or D major.
Yeah. Well, I think the point is that you want to really focus on making the notation as clear and as simple for the performers as possible. Because whatever works, so that the player, our goal is we want to make music as musicians. So if the score is easy to look at and you just sit down and you play, then you could focus on learning the music and playing. And I think one thing that really frustrates players is when you're struggling to try to understand what's on the page, you know, rhythmically or note-wise, or, you know, because you could, all of us, it's very easy to write things that just don't make sense, because we as musicians, we were looking for, when we're learning the music, we're looking for patterns. And if you see clear patterns in the music, it makes it easy to learn it, and or much easier to learn it and internalize it and make music with it, versus you're trying to understand the intent of the composer. And notation is a critical part of that.
Like mixing sharps and flats are actually something that destroys our brain sometimes.
Yeah.
In a same bar, in a same chord. I
Yeah.
think in the same chord, it changes the way that we think about the distance of measuring it, about which fingers we use, that sort of thing. So mixing the two is maybe not a good cocktail.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even just today we were dealing with the E flat, D flat, B natural, and we're like, that felt weird, and there was no reason why those couldn't be a D sharp and a C sharp instead, to just make it work, because that's what it sounded like functionally. And I didn't want to see a C flat, but that would have been better actually, in a way, right? And so, that matters. But I think for me, like, if I can speak as a composer now, like, my philosophy when I approach things is that, of course, you want to write the piece as this beautiful thing that is on its own. But if you think of it from the fact that that's going to get channeled through performers, the more the performers enjoy, or like, the more satisfying it is to get into it, and the more that it's like, the less work it is to understand it. And I'm not saying it doesn't have to be difficult, because it certainly can be difficult. Catherine's piece was not easy, but it's like, there's something satisfying to bite in, and like, so the more satisfying you make it to the musicians, the better your piece will sound. Yeah. And you know, you could write the same piece and just like write the wrong accidentals and put the wrong, just even beaming things the wrong way, you know?
Yeah.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
And
That
we
is a big
just
one.
all of a sudden and then we kind of play this performance that we're not really kind of into, and
Until
it's the
like
same
we can't
piece,
feel like
but
we
all
can
of a
get into
sudden
it.
it doesn't sound as good.
Yeah,
So
it makes a
will
difference.
reflect well on you if you make it, if you think about the performance aspect a little bit.
Yeah,
Speaking
absolutely.
about writing, I just want to mention the range of the instrument and where does the instrument sound well. And I want to give maybe a mic to Matt to talk a little bit about the viola range and what feels good and what is a little bit harder to project on.
That's interesting. I feel like kind of the middle of the viola is kind of the most happy place, where it kind of just feels the best, like. And then, so that's kind of like your classic viola sound, right? You could play like the same thing. Over there, but again, these are kind of soft sounds, right? So
Play the same thing on the A string. It's just so much brighter.
It's so much brighter, yeah, and it's. In a way, I feel like the open A on the viola is kind of one of the ugliest sounds.
But the thing is that if you're writing a solo for viola that's quiet and maybe supported by cello, then you can do it in that range. But if we are doing some sort of a rhythm, viola in that range, on the G string, a lower range, is not going to project.
Yeah.
So you might want to try to give it a lower sound, like on the C string, to really go to hear it, or maybe a little bit higher on the A string. So there's definitely certain challenges that we encounter in terms of range and emotion that's being put on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that the context, or like thinking about the note and the range, as you pointed out, like can we do play like an A below middle C? Can you play that same note?
Mm-hmm.
Stop. And then if so for me it's the same note, but I'm sounding more like a tenor than you are. So I've got the brighter sound, even though it's the bigger instrument. And so it's like, it's one of those things like, do you want to play that melody on the G string on the violin, making it sound really dark? Or do you want to give it to the viola where you've got that richer sound? Or do you want it to be bright and give it to the cello? I mean, then you've got a bass problem, but anyways. So that context, and similarly, like the cello can go up here. It's just going to sound a little bit more like
Punchy.
this, rather than, and it's going to have less brilliance to it.
It's kind of what you're
Exactly.
doing. It's the
Pretty much.
same note, but
But
it
you know,
just gets
but you
darker.
will see contexts where you have the cellist playing a solo and high up on the A string, and then the rest of the quartet underneath.
Yeah, I mean,
The
boarding.
Yeah.
So it's
Boarding,
starting at
yeah.
the A, like above middle C. But you know, it doesn't mean that we can't go up there. It just means that you need to voice
manage
things.
other
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just because the viola's in the middle doesn't mean it can't be the top voice.
Mm-hmm.
Same.
Yep, that's right. You could very often you'll have the cello part and then the viola underneath the cello
Yeah.
doing accompaniment, and
Absolutely.
that works really well.
Mhm.
Well, we
Do
could.
you have any questions in the room by any chance? Or
Yep, we have 3 people in attendance today, so thank you for coming in person.
Oh, we have some questions on the stream.
Oh,
Oh,
cool.
Great, yeah. Let's because we're over an hour and a half, so let's answer a few questions and we'll wrap it up.
So there's 4 questions. Which articulations are related to the speed of the bow versus the separation of the string?
For the speed of the bow versus the separation of the string?
Yeah.
so separation of string.
I think like
Oh,
like
do you
staccato
mean
versus spiccato kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I guess the faster that something goes, the more that the bow wants to jump. Our bows are actually made to jump, so not made to stay down. So if you move slow, but if I take that rhythm and speed that up, then I'm just going to speed it up gradually, and you'll see what happens. It wants to jump, right? So there's like a sort of like a terminal or maximum velocity in which we can stay down before getting a cramp. That is, we can make it stay down. It'll just take a lot more effort.
Can you make
but
it? Can you
stay-
just
stay
do
down?
the same thing but stay down?
Like I can't. Like I actually have to tense my body.
It becomes
in
a
uncomfortable
tremolo
way, but-
basically. It becomes a tremolo.
Yeah, true,
So
true.
and if you say, oh, that's too connected, I want it separate, then you would write this thing that we talked earlier, staccato or spiccato rather. So in that tempo. But the other technique we talked about was this the jeté, and so when we play with but
That's way harder.
so it's
Way
it's
harder.
much trickier. So that we wanna connect the strings with. So it all depends. The speed definitely affects
Yeah.
the way we're going to approach it and play it. And sometimes we will even slur these notes because it's just going to be almost impossible. As Tanya says, we started cramping. So it's we will connect it and then it's going to be much easier.
And you notice that when he goes faster, it does jump a bit because we want to release our muscles so that we don't cramp, right? So automatically the bow starts to do its natural thing, which is to
Yeah.
jump.
the other question there is, how would you notate a gradual accelerando or ritardando of the bow speed?
Of the bow speed, interesting.
So there's I know in the Barber cello sonata, there's a moment where you actually see that, and you see that problem in action, because there was no proper notation for it, and it's a bunch of 16th notes, and they start off with dots. The dots disappear, and there's lines at the end, and you just have to kind of like, as in like dashes over it, and you have to kind of just go, okay, wait, short, medium, long, fine, I can see the direction that he's going for, but it's actually really hard to notate. Words can help, and one thing to note is, you don't need to feel inferior by using your own language. Put English in there. It doesn't have to be translated into Italian or Esperanto or whatever it is. Like, you can write an instruction in English. It's fine, or whatever language that you're doing. And if it's your own language and we don't speak that language, we'll pull out.
Look it up. Google
Translate.
Translate.
Even if you were to write gradually speed up,
or speed up bow or something,
or
just create a notation for it if you really feel that it's necessary. Like, it's going to happen a lot of times. You don't want to write that paragraph of instructions. Just like, put it at the beginning. This is what this notation that I'm designating is going to be, and just use it.
Yeah, you could literally like just start with dots, and basically the line gets longer and longer and longer until you've got this long line on top or whatever. Yeah. And you put that in the legend at the beginning of the piece, and then that's what it is.
Exactly.
There's no established notation, I think, for that.
Yeah, I would say that there are inconsistencies in notation.
Yeah.
So, for example, for us string players, when we see a tenuto mark over a note, it usually means that there's a slight separation.
Yeah.
And winds is completely different. It means it's totally legato. But for us, totally legato means there's nothing there.
Yeah.
So there's it's tricky. And so writing for strings and winds, there's slight differences, and when it comes to extended techniques, you'll see different things and different ways of notating. So again, work with your performers and define the notation that's going to work for everyone.
I will say, actually, myself as a composer, I've done this exact technique, and what I did is I had rhythms above the staff that were contrary to the rhythms in the staff. So like a trill or like a 16th note figure in the staff for the fingers, and then it's separate rhythm with no note heads on top of the staff for the bow.
Interesting.
Oh, that's an interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting solution. Yeah.
But exactly, just like you come up with these things.
There was another question about the difference between touch 4th, 3rd, and 5th harmonics.
My faves. I'm like the harmonic queen. I love thinking about this stuff. I'm so nerdy about it. So yeah, it's the pitch that is emitted. So I mean, we're sort of bound by fourths in terms of how low we can go on the violin, and it only goes from the open string fourth. That's the lowest we can get. But if you wanted something lower, we can actually do a touch fifth, and it goes even lower than that. So this is a touch fifth. So this is you can just watch my hand shape go from a fourth to a fifth, and the pitch actually is lower. Yeah. So
camera, I think, is what's
so it actually produces the fifth that is plus an octave above what the note on the bottom is. That is very confusing. So I'm touching an A below the staff. My fourth finger is at the E on a fifth above, and it sounds like that.
So our lowest, the lowest would be then.
True that. Yeah.
So that would be this note, right?
Mm. Yeah.
So if you were to put your.
But I mean, like, it actually drops the pitch of where the harmonics are when we touch them at the fourth.
Yeah. So the fourth will shorten the string less, which means it's going to be higher, and the fifth will shorten the string more, which is going to make it lower.
In order to really understand all those, I mean, I recommend just looking up, because it's one of those the halfway is going to be one octave above. When you go the fourth, it goes 2 octaves above. When you're at a third of the string, which is a fifth, it's an octave plus a fifth. And if you're at a sixth, then you're like an octave plus a third, like an octave plus a third. So 2 octaves plus a third. So like it's just
physics.
And
Yeah,
it really
it
is like
It
I have
really
this-
comes down to physics, the way the string
You
divides.
can
Yeah.
technically do touch thirds, but like those are much harder to
But
to speak.
they are, and the thing is, like, you know, because the way that the string length is being shortened, it's and with the whole like sine wave thing is there's nodes, and so these happen at different places. So I mean, we're gonna pick the one which is most convenient to us.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, just know that they can be put in context. We'll just do whichever one is best. But if you have a particular sound like openness that you're looking for, that is something over here, then I'm not gonna look for it over here on the G string. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And if you really want
I
to
might not even find it.
if you really want to impress your friends, you learn to play this.
Wow.
So
Cool.
that's actually like your fifth, thirds, and fourths, like all sort of
Yeah.
in a nutshell.
So I'd like to actually recommend a resource besides, there's excellent orchestration books by Adler, Kennan, Piston, but there's an inexpensive one called the Essential Dictionary of Orchestration, and it's published by Alfred. And what they have, which is really cool, that I've never seen in another book, is very extensive chart for every string instrument of all the natural harmonics on all the strings. And
Very cool.
yeah, see, it's probably way too far away to see, but there's these really cool charts, but there's some information on different aspects and unusual instruments. It's a really good book for people who want to orchestrate for a variety of instruments. So inexpensive, but a really great resource.
If I can just address, though, as artificial harmonics, touch third, touch fourth, touch fifth, the sound will be the same, and we can usually get around with the touch fourth, anyways. So trying to write something like mostly like 99% of the time, the touch fourth will give you everything you need. It'll sound the best. It'll be the most
Easiest to
accurate.
find. Yeah.
So don't unless it's one of those things where you're trying to where the note actually the block is in the same spot, and this would be more accurate with you guys. Touch fifth doesn't work so well on cello. It's just a distance thing. So unless you're kind of shifting between those, just keep it at touch fourth. It's just there's no real advantage to go anywhere else.
Yeah.
So this actually leads nicely into the last question, which is, since natural harmonics are only in some places, is it just safer to use artificial harmonics all the time?
Sound difference.
Yeah.
The biggest change between artificial and natural. Natural's going to sound more open. And artificial ones just sound a touch muted, depending on which ones you're using.
And very important, very, very important piece of advice is don't go too high with harmonics.
Yes.
Because the violin will support. We actually had recently recorded a piece, and I was really struggling to get them to speak. So let's see. So I would say a B. Like how you guys call it? Touch something?
You're doing a touch fourth.
I learned this for the first time tonight. So let's say this is E string. So we have F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, B, C sharp. It just becomes some sort of a squeak. It's not really a note. So if you give me a beautiful melody that starts on this note, it's not going to be beautiful. So
It's just because our string length is so short by that point. I don't know how that would differ on a cello. Maybe it'd be different, but on
Same thing. The higher artificial harmonics
There's
get
a whole
quite difficult.
physics lesson there, but we'll skip
Yeah, it
for
gets
now.
quite difficult to get those to pop out. Yeah.
There's potentially an advantage to the touch three there, but
So the thing is basically, so we'll get into it for a second. Basically, if I'm playing this, the string is resonating the equivalent. If I'm playing it here, and if I finger it this way, it'll be that way. So if I'm now doing this, whatever note, that's the equivalent of the note length. That's how the string is vibrating. It's vibrating to this place. The only difference between now and the previous time is that this is vibrating here and here and here. That's the only difference, is that it's actually duplicating. So our bow has to be placed in the right spot appropriately. So now if you're trying to get me to play like these notes that don't sound great, it doesn't matter if it's touch fourth, touch fifth, touch third, it'll still be
that type
trying
of
to
sound.
produce that note,
Right.
and your string is still trying to vibrate this much.
Yeah.
On it's just the only thing is just being duplicated, and this is I'm trying to use the I'm trying to not get into.
Yeah. They're
big
very
things.
much more tricky to find, the thirds.
Yeah.
Like the fourths we
Well, I've
practice
been
a lot.
writing the thirds.
The fifths,
No.
okay. Thirds, less.
But
less
isn't
less than that.
it's also interesting because like we'll actually I don't know if it's maybe less common with you guys, but like when I'm playing, if it's not marked as a harmonic, I'll easily go and hit that harmonic, no problem, right? And we've certainly cheated with like some of those things. Like we'll cheat with harmonics all the time. But as a general, if you're writing like melodic stuff in harmonics, yeah, just go touch fourth, just write it.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
you don't need to like do a bunch of touch fourths and then find a natural one and then go back and forth. That is very problematic for us.
Yeah.
If you want to see something really problematic, look at the Schoenberg cello concerto. It's just all of those things. It sounds easy, and it's extremely difficult because basically he's just jumping between all the things, and you're like you just do all this, and all you did is a scale, and it's just like it took me I think an hour and a half to read through the first page, like just figuring out what he's talking about is
then not good cello writing.
Yeah.
Not good.
I mean, it's super cool, but it's not worth the work.
Yeah.
No, I shouldn't
It
say
is
that.
Well, he wrote it for Casals, and Casals' look is a no.
Yeah.
Not gonna happen.
Exactly.
And then Foreman, who had an incredible technique, was like, okay, this is my time to shine.
And this is not a 12-tone piece. This is a Baroque piece, to be clear.
Yeah, and then he
wrote-
rearranged it with this
Yeah.
crazy
So
cello
it's
part.
not like out there. It's actually meant to sound really pretty and easy. So
Yeah. Anyway, I think we're coming up on 2 hours, so I think we
Joseph?
need to call it. But thank you so much, Odins. You're amazing. I love listening to you talking about string playing. I love talking about string playing. And thank you so much to Joseph at the CMC and to our guests here who attended. And just those of you who are watching online, feel free to reach out and communicate and talk. We'll be in touch. So thank you so much.